Hello everyone! For my 10,000 subscribers, I wanted to clear the controversial and hypersexualized reputation of my channel that my recent Marquis de Sade videos have created. While these have been extremely successful, and a lesser man would have milked said success, I am better than that. At its core, this is a very serious channel about various serious topics, and it is time that my videos start reflecting that. And what can be more uncontroversial and serious than the review of a historical movie? So, today, I'm reviewing a 1989 movie about the French Revolution made by Pierre B. Renard. Now, I had never heard of this director, but I was reassured by the fact that he had already made historical movies in the past, such as Le Diable Rose, which discusses life in Nazi-occupied France. Needless to say, I had high hopes that were immediately shattered upon reading the title of the movie, Les Petites Culottes de la Révolution, which translates to The Panties of the Revolution. Yeah. This is clearly a mistake, and they most certainly meant to write Les Sans-Culottes de la Révolution in reference to the urban lower class during the French Revolution. Their name came from the fact that they wore trousers as opposed to the upper bourgeoisie and the nobles who wore silk breeches known as culottes. But to have a historical movie about the French Revolution make such a basic mistake in the title was far from promising, especially when that mistake was rather embarrassing. Nevertheless, I decided to carry forward and give this movie a chance. The movie starts on June 27, 1772, with Le Marquis de Sade and his manservant/lover, Latour, enjoying a prostitute together. Obviously, I was quite upset. Imagine me desperately trying to avoid mentioning the controversial Marquis de Sade as to preserve the fragile reputation of my channel, only for the first scene of this historical movie to depict him copulating, and quite explicitly as well. Furthermore, it all felt quite needless. Why feature at all Le Marquis de Sade in a movie about the sans-culottes? Sure, he had some influence on the French Revolution, but I would definitely not associate him with the sans-culottes, preferring instead characters like Marat or Hébert, the creator of the Père Duchesne. So, frankly, I was disappointed, but at least they got the date right, as June 1772 was when Le Marquis de Sade and his servant were sentenced to death for sodomy, and less importantly, at least in those times, for attempted murder on 4 prostitutes by giving them a poisonous aphrodisiac. Credit where credit is due, this historical moment is portrayed perfectly in this movie, albeit after an excruciatingly long sex scene which was made particularly awkward by the fact that I was watching this movie with my family. And while at first I was understandably uncomfortable, the genius of the director soon became apparent, as I understood that it was simply an elaborate metaphor for how the clergy and the nobility treated the third estate. Allow me to illustrate. Here is the clergy, here is the nobility, and here is the third estate being fucked over by the former. Genius. The movie then jumps to 1789, or the beginning of the Revolution, and we are immediately blasted by a fellatio scene between a noble and a peasant named Charlotte. This is a clear reference to Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer who murdered the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat in his bathtub. However, the fact that Corday is literally sucking the dick of the nobility is quite concerning, as it clearly shows the bias of the director who decided to portray her as a royalist sympathizer. And personal beliefs aside, I do not think that historical movies should have such obvious signs of bias, nor close-ups of fellatios for that matter. After yet another extended sex scene in a horse carriage, we see the noble, Monsieur le Comte, arrive at the residence of his friend, Monsieur le Marquis, where they immediately partake in a wild BDSM orgy. The following 15 minutes spent with my family was perhaps the most awkward and unpleasant moment of my life, topped only by my first kiss at 21 in a back street of Kuala Lumpur with a Malaysian prostitute. But finally, the orgy comes to an end, and I leave a sigh of relief as I find comfort in the belief that I might get a pause from this constant sexual bashing, only to be slapped in the face with a close-up of yet another fellatio. And that's where I must discuss my first major critique of this movie. Now, I'm not complaining about the fact that there's sex involved. I am no prude. Furthermore, sex was omnipresent in the Ancien Régime, and it was not at all uncommon for the King of France to have mistresses, with Louis XIV having 16 children with 6 mistresses, while Henri IV was infamous for having over 30 mistresses throughout his lifetime. In the words of Mel Brooks, it's good to be king. In fact, Louis XVI was the exception, not the rule, for being in a monogamous relationship. So no, the sex itself is not a problem, it's just the sheer amount of it, and I am starting to think that it's impacting the narration of the story. It is only after 40 minutes into this movie about the sans-culottes that we finally encounter those so-called sans-culottes, fighting at the Bastille against the royalist troops, and I have numerous issues with this scene. First, they really dropped the ball when it came to the extras budget. Yes, less than 1,000 stormed the Bastille, which wasn't a lot, but this is really pushing it in order to save some money. However, after watching Dunkirk, I've come to realize that this was a common theme in historical movies, so I'll let that one pass. Second, the French tricolor flag did not exist at that time, having been designed a year later, and it would have been more accurate if the sans-culottes wore a red and blue cockade, which were the colors of the Parisians. Third, this is taking place in a field in the middle of nowhere, which would have been fine if this was the 15th century, but by the time of the French Revolution, the area surrounding the Bastille had become quite populated, having the dense Faubourg Saint-Antoine right besides it. And finally, we hear the Marquis de Sade screaming from his cell about how the guards are killing everyone. Which did happen, but almost 2 weeks before the storming of the Bastille. In fact, it is one of the events that led to this fateful day. Also, they tried to make us believe that this guy looks anything like this guy. We later see our friends, Monsieur le Marquis and Monsieur le Comte, getting ready to emigrate from France following the storming of the Bastille. And while some people did emigrate in 1789, including the aunt of the king, mass immigration only started in 1791, as the revolution became increasingly more radical and violent. After their master abandoned his chateau, the servants decide to celebrate by singing "Asaira, Saira, Saira," an emblematic revolutionary song that was created a year later. And while this might seem like I'm nitpicking small details, it's those small details that tell you whether the director cared to portray an accurate representation of the revolution or not. We are now back in the carriage, and our break from these endless copulations, alas, comes to an end, as our two friends are now sharing a woman. Soon enough, Monsieur le Marquis starts performing Anilingus on this fine young lady, which is a clear reference to the infamous phrase often associated with Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake." However, she never said that. The phrase actually comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's own autobiography, Confessions. In it, he recounts the story of a great prince who had exclaimed, "Then let them eat cake," after he was told that the peasantry had no bread. The phrase had since been used to smear clueless, out-of-touch wealthy nobles, which Marie Antoinette has often been accused of being. It's a shame this quote-unquote historical movie further promotes this myth. The movie now jumps a few years to 1793, right in the middle of the Reign of Terror. There, we meet two executioners about to guillotine a Jew, although one of them comments that they don't need to guillotine him as he's already been cut. Dubious jokes aside, this movie seems to imply that this man was guillotined solely for being Jewish, and thus that the revolution was anti-Semitic. And while Catholic priests who failed to reject the authority of the Pope were often persecuted, I find little evidence of Jewish persecution during the French Revolution. If anything, it largely benefited them as they were finally emancipated in 1791, making France the second country in Europe to offer full rights to Jewish people after Poland had done so more than 500 years prior. So not only a tasteless joke, but a woefully inaccurate one. And once again, wrong flag. While the tricolor had been adopted by then, the colors were inverted and should be red, white, and blue. It was only in 1794 that the current arrangement of the tricolor was adopted. We are now introduced to Marat, an important character in the French Revolution. Although his presence here is brief and does not bring much to the story, but to be fair, there hasn't been much story at all. Marat is given a bath prepared by no less than Charlotte Corday, of course, but instead of stabbing him to avenge the downfall of the Girondins, she blows him? Now that's where I say no. This is pure historical revisionism, and the worst part is that she kills him by accidentally stabbing him when he comes in for a kiss. What? How could this movie ever pretend to be historical? It's a farce. Why would you have Corday blow, metaphorically, of course, the nobility, to then have her blow, metaphorically, the revolution, and then pretend that she murdered Marat by accident? Why is she so ideologically inconsistent? It does not make sense. Needless to say, I was quite upset at this point. I can excuse the unnecessary amount of sex. This is a French movie after all. But I draw the line when this so-called historical movie just straight up invents stuff. And it's not like the acting is good either. Does this look like a woman devastated by the fact that she accidentally killed a man? No. As a result of this stabbing, Corday ends up raped, tortured, and then executed. And while Corday did indeed get executed for her involvement in the death of Marat, having very willingly and purposefully stabbed him, there is no evidence that she was raped and tortured. The Revolutionary Tribunal didn't need to, as they had plenty of evidence of her murder. So this is needless, and yet another excuse for the director to plug in yet another sex scene, much like a Lars von Trier movie. We now find our old friends, Monsieur le Marquis and Monsieur le Comte, having returned to their domain, which would have been the stupidest thing to do considering the fact that this was right in the middle of the Reign of Terror. Why they would emigrate in 1789 only to come back when the revolution had only gone more extreme and violent is beyond me. And as expected, they end up guillotined, although not before receiving last-switch blowjobs for some reasons. And thus the movie ends with the servants taking part in a celebratory foursome to commemorate the death of their tyrannical masters. Perhaps a visual representation of how the British painted the French Revolution as a clusterfuck of debauchery? Undoubtedly. Or perhaps it's a Marxist critique of how, in the grand scheme of things, the revolution did not change much, as the bourgeoisie simply replaced the aristocracy without fixing the inherent inequalities that plagued their society, resulting in the revolutionaries living the very lives that their masters had once lived, thus making this a direct reference to the ending of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. So in the end, how do I feel about this historical movie? Well, it was definitely not what I expected, and I fear it did little to improve the reputation of my channel. It was certainly filmed on the cheaper side, but that's not always a bad thing, and can easily be made up for with great acting, a great story, and a great director. However, this movie has none of that, but at least it succeeds in being more historically accurate than Braveheart. It's still a terrible movie, and the sex, oh god, so much sex. And for those reasons, I must give it 5 baguettes out of 5. You should check out this movie, although preferably without your family. Well, this was Barris. I will see you soon. But until then, my friends, merde!